I'm Dazza Greenwood of Civics.com, and this is a proposal made in collaboration with the Open Dialogue Coalition for Recovery.Gov to use an open, public, integrated architecture. Identity is perhaps the most important component of an architecture of this kind, and it must operate at both the personal and the community layers. The board and panel should create an expert standing advisory panel to help determine the correct requirements for an identity infrastructure, and as a matter of principle, people's civic ID should be their own. The next most important component of the architecture for Recovery.Gov is dialogue. Just as the national dialogue.org was used as a tool at this point of Recovery.Gov implementation design work, so too should dialogues be a regular part of that architecture. Community is the next most important component because knowledge communities somehow have to be involved in both the creation, the sharing, and the dissemination of Recovery.Gov data. And collaboration. How can Recovery.Gov go beyond the mere passive public monitoring of data to enable feedback and participation? How can it enable collaboration? Because after all, people who are responsible for the Recovery Act implementation will be depending on Recovery.Gov day in and day out to meet their responsibilities and to achieve the purposes and the programs of the Act. So in what way can Recovery.Gov enable the collaboration that will be so critical to meeting the mission of the Recovery Act? Here's an example of how Recovery.Gov looks right now. If you take a look at the timeline, you'll see that the information hasn't changed since the site went live, and there's just a few items on there that clearly have been put on by hand. Same kind of problems with the statute. Notice that it's locked in a PDF document. You can't link to particular paragraphs. If you want to find testimony from the chairman of the Recovery Board that oversees Recovery.Gov, it's available. You can find it on Google, but for a price. The first thing you need to do is put all the pieces together in an integrated architecture. The most superficial level of integration is data integration. So as you can see, these simile widgets are, in a sense, application agnostic, and they're data-driven. So once you have data-driven applications, the next thing you want to do is allow the users to have some ability to correlate the data across different visualizations. That's the intelligence of the semantics of Web 2.0 data-driven widgets of this type. So in this case, you can see the selector lens is the religions of the U.S. presidents, and it will show you on the map and the timeline all of the presidents with that particular criteria selected. And so similarly with Recovery.Gov, you can imagine on the timeline and in the map information popping up from a lens about grants in a topic like energy or available within a state or within a certain frame of time. And it's so easy to allow websites to syndicate their RSS or Atom or other web service feeds so that those feeds can be easily harvested and then later deliberately selected individually or in combination by the user. And here's how such an integrated architecture could look from the point of view of an end user on Recovery.Gov, taking a look at the timeline and how it is by using those RSS feeds, it would be possible to harvest a variety of sources of data and easily give the user explicit selection and control over which data from which sources and what types will appear on visualizations like the timeline. So in this case, we have lenses for government and non-government sources of data. It's possible to give the user fine-grained selection. And how can you know what's relevant? Well, only based on an understanding of what it is that the end user thinks is relevant, what's relevant to them. So we give them selectors of the lenses, which are the source of the data, allowing them to understand the type and the source of data and to select that deliberately. and also selectors for the frames, which is another way to call a widget or a web application or process. We have one for the statute, which you've seen. You could have one for video. You could have one for dialogues. One key aspect of this open public integrated architecture approach is its extensibility at the core levels of its design and usability. So, for example, while we've envisioned many of the common types of widgets and applications here already, such as timelines and maps, we've also made provision for emerging services such as dialogues and community services, and we've made it possible to easily modularly snap in new kinds of widgets or applications and new types of data sources and types that haven't even been invented yet. That's why it's extensible, and that's why it's highly adaptive. And how do we get there? With an open public integrated architecture. Open, meaning open data, open standards, and where possible, open source. Public, meaning kicking it up to government-grade interaction level of security, safety, trustworthiness, but also underlying principles like due process. Integrated, as in integrated at the legal, business, and technological layers, but also integrated for the end user. And an architecture enabling open design of explicit and provably achievable outcomes. Like a blueprint, it's possible to use this architecture to determine whether or not the implementation has met the requirements. First, continue the online dialogues. Second, have an explicit architecture that's values-driven and at a minimum reflects the statutory requirements for the website. Also, consider yourself like a service bureau, not selecting the solution, but more like being an approved solution source, like the R store, instead of the I store, and leveraging GSA's expertise in certification. We believe that a formal civic selector set of semantic widgets like this give the user a powerful civic engagement tool enabling the deliberate and explicit selection from among different providers of data, different sources of information, allowing a deliberate and aware and hopefully informed choice of selectors for sets of lenses that show the aspects and facets of reality with respect, in this case, to the Recovery Act implementation that they find relevant based on their role, based on their interests, based on the purposes that they individually have as individual citizens and organizations in being engaged in this process. And so without presupposing what those types of tools are or those types of views by selecting a particular platform or particular solution, this type of open public integrated architecture provides a framework within which it's possible to throw open to all comers the ability to participate, but also begin to create formal or approved lists based on accreditation or certification as necessary to effectuate the specific statutory aims of the Act. And consider this: if there were a basis based on GSA approval or otherwise for there to be a federal, state, and local tab, that could, in fact, seed an entire market for civic engagement services and information. Future work for the Open Dialogue Coalition includes a pilot of a new online dispute resolution crowdsourcing widget done in collaboration with Harvard's Berkman Center and the MIT Media Lab, and working in collaboration with the Mass Health Data Consortium to put their overview of the health IT sections of the Recovery Act integrated into the Act itself. The members of the Open Dialogue Coalition and our partners will be public upon our launch. For purposes of this preliminary demo, I'd like to thank Daniel Bennett from AdvocateHope.org, Salona Bonewald and Citability.org, Lou Klepner and Gateway.Gov.org, and Ray Campbell and the eCitizen Foundation.org.